Hello viewers, we are going to study about the poet Boris Pasternak, who has written the poem Spring. Boris Pasternak, a Nobel laureate, was highly regarded in his native Russia as one of the country's greatest post-revolutionary poets. He did not gain worldwide acclaim, however, until his only novel, Dr. Zhivago, was first published in Europe in 1958. Just 2 years before the author's death. Banned in Russia as anti-Soviet, Pasternak's controversial prose work was hailed as a literary masterpiece by both American and European critics. But its publication was suppressed in Russia until 1988. The attention focused on Pasternak and his work as a result of Zhivago affairs brought with it a renewed public interest in the author's early writings. Consequently, numerous English translations of Pasternak's entire canon, including his poetry, autobiographical prose, and Dr. Zhivago, became readily available in the Western world. Born in 1890 to a cultivated, cosmopolitan Moscow family, Pasternak grew up in an atmosphere that fostered an appreciation of the art and the pursuit of artistic endeavors. His father, Leonid, was a permanent Russian portrait painter and art teacher, and his mother, Rosa, was a former concert pianist who forfeited her promising musical career in the interest of her husband and children. The Pasternaks were part of an exclusive social circle that consisted of Russia's finest musicians, writers, and painters, including premier novelist Leo Tolstoy and composer Alexander Scriabin, Sergei Rachmaninoff, and Anton Rubinstein. In the rich cultural surroundings of Pasternak's home, observed Gradru in Pasternak, a pictorial biography, which says, art was a normal activity which needed neither explanation nor apology, and which could fill out and take possessions of the man's whole life. Pasternak was only 4 years old when he first met Tolstoy, who attended a concert at Pasternak's given by Boris' mother and 2 other professors from the Moscow Conservatory. In his 1959 memoir, I Remember, sketch for an autobiography, Pasternak reflected on the impact of the music, especially that of the stringed instruments played in Tolstoy's honor. He says, I was awakened by a sweet pain, more violent than any I had experienced before. I cried out and burst into tears from fear and anguish. My memory became active and my consciousness was set in motion. From that time, I believed in the existence of a higher heroic world which must be served rapturously, though it might bring its suffering. The family's ongoing contact with Tolstoy, Leonid illustrated the author's novella, that is, Resurrection, in the year 1898, culminated in the forlorn station where Tolstoy lay dead in a narrow, humble room. Related Mac Solomon in the New York Times Book Review, he says, according to Solomon, the author's moving recollections brought to life at Tolstoy's wake and documented in I Remember. demonstrate how great a part the creator of War and Peace in the ethical formation of Pasternak, particularly in his developing attitude towards history and nature. An encounter in 1903 with the celebrated composer Scriabin promoted the 14-year-old Pasternak to devote himself entirely to the composition of music. He eagerly embraced the study of music at the Moscow Conservatory and under composer Reinhold Goehel, but completely renounced his chosen vocation 6 years later. He attributed the need for this difficult and radical decision to his lack of both technical skill and pitch recognition. Explaining in I Remember, he says, "I could scarcely play the piano and could not even read music with any fluency." This discrepancy between the musical idea and its lagging technical support transforms nature's gifts, which could have served as a source of joy, into an object of constant torment, which in the end I could no longer endure. After studying philosophy at the Marlborough University in the year 1912 under the neo-Kantian scholar Hermann Cohen, who propounded a philosophy of coherence and world order and abjured human intuition or irrationality, Pasternak again made an abrupt and radical change in his life. Leaving Marlborough that same summer, D. Malk noted that while Pasternak did not observe all of Cohen's theories, was influenced by the philosopher's monotheism and highly ethical standards. In her prologue in the year 1976 edition of Pasternak, that is, My Sister Life and Other Poems, Olga and Rivi reaffirmed that although philosophy was to remain an important element in his life, after the summer in the year 1912, it was no longer central concern. The experience of being rejected by a lover was a catalyst that turned Pasternak into a poet. In the year 1912, Ida Davidova, a young woman whom Pasternak had known since childhood, refused the author's proposal of marriage. D. Malk noted that for Pasternak, creativity, self-renewal, directly induced by a stormy passion. The intensity of the experience with Davidova, theorized D. Malk, affected Pasternak so strongly that he soon made another decision. He would not marry a woman. He would divorce a profession. Impelled by a new poetic perception of the world, he began writing poetry. After traveling to Italy, Pasternak returned to Moscow to write. The realization that the life around him takes part in the poet's emotions and experiences is a fundamental element of Pasternak's poetic conception and is present in his work beginning with the earliest poems. Today, we shall act his melancholy, that is in the year 1913. The whole city participates in the poet's dejection. He endows his surroundings with his own emotion. The poet's feeling is central. The concrete objects of the world around him illustrates his conditions and in the background as in the poem. Marked by, there is life of whose permanent collaboration the poet is assured. In an earlier version of this poem, the closing line points more explicitly to an active participation of the surroundings. It says, "Oh, my city, all day today, my sadness never leaves your lips." The experience of nature's and life's participation in his emotion leads the poet to a feeling of equality and brotherhood with the whole universe. He becomes a part of the miraculous night where the far and the near fuse. With me on the level, with my candle, the blossoming world are suspended. He dissolves in this night, converts to it, as I join this night, as I would an unheard of faith. The poet becomes a part of the garden at night, which assumes the dimensions of the universe. In Safe Conduct, trying to elucidate the interrelationship of man and nature, Pasternak maintains the nature is introduced into poetry so as to depict the poet's passion, and conversely, human passion is depicted so as to bring in nature. The two elements appear to be equal and completely interchangeable. A description of a wholesale flower market in the same section of the Safe Conduct is a good example of man and nature sharing emotions and representing each other. The poet is especially tempted to visit the market in the early spring. The luminous March, twilighting frequently the filthy rooms of a cheap hotel and restraining the poet at the door. The suddenly appearing and whispering streets, the steps of the spring in the air, and the shivering outlines of the streets are introduced in order to convey the poet's sudden awareness of the approaching spring. Flowers stand for the essence of seasonal change, the wisdom of ever-returning life. The poet feels a part of this cosmic rejuvenation, but the emotions that this realization calls forth in him are attributed to the flowers. The excitement of the poet is carried over to them. They rage, breathe, become agitated. In enormous tubs, sheaves of peonies, yellow daisies, tulips, and stroked out according to colors and varieties, rage in competition with the lamps. They breathed and were agitated as if grappling with each other. Life's and nature's concern for the poet is the subjective aspect of Pasternak's new poetic vision that allows him to experience the mutual interdependence of things and phenomena on a broader scope. Visually, it manifests itself as the unusual sharpness of individual details. I walked out onto the square. I could be regarded as someone born for the second time. Every detail lived and disregarding me entirely arose in its departing significance. In this poem, Spring, the poet talks about the onset of spring and its beautiful surroundings. He goes on to say that spring brings a life and joy, peace and love. The poet tries to manifest and magnifies its beautiful qualities and what kind of growth and development that takes place in this particular season of spring. In the first stanza, he talks about the sticky buds which get rejuvenated and remoisturizes due to the spring season. The candle ends bring a change in the plants around which sprouts the shoot of new leaves. The beautiful small green-leafed plants on the branches of the tree is the symbol of life and growth. He compares the season of spring to puberty, as it brings the physical changes in the adolescence and gets the child ready for adulthood. It is also the same with spring season. Like the puberty which brings in lots of changes in the physical nature, environment, which results in growth and development of the trees and the parks, gardens and forests, which look differently and shine differently. But all this while the nature was knotted by dryness. The woods, which have to be green and lively, were suffering and groaning in pain. Like the gardioral organ, which is the indication of funeral. The steel pipe was singing the song of dryness and lifelessness. But the poet challenges nature by the art of his poetry, that like a Greek sponge with suckers, he is going to bring back greenness, green stickiness, and green life. I will consent by the gone winter that spring will bring in the green stained and green benches again. This spring will help the dry plant grow splendidly and magnificently. It will grow impetuous to stick up the ditches with life and also help the crowds to do their work. The poet finally says, "Poetry tonight, I will squeeze you out to the maximum to make this parched land have sheets of flowers blossom, and it will spread this greenness and fragrance to all." Even as a casual reader of Pasternak's poetry cannot fail to observe the predominance of his raging element over stable condition in his nature and a virtual lack of static scenes and immovable objects in his poetry in general. In nature's inexhaustible source of dynamism lies one of its chief attractions for Pasternak. That is, but nature is not dependable. It cannot be forced to stay put. I thirst for change, which its whole body, and it blossoms due to a concrete desire for something spectacular. He is naturally attracted to storms and it's afraid of calm. I take calm seas. I fear, as I fear, the nearby screech of a bat, the silence of such calm, the calm of such silences. In the late 20s and 30s, Pasternak's serious Soviet critics had a hard time reconciling the acknowledged prevalence of action to the immediate surroundings of his lyrical hero. It was often argued that by depicting nature through human emotions, movements, and actions, Pasternak reduced even natural phenomena of the level of his everyday life and physical ambience, and by this manifested his unmistakably bourgeois. Marian Tessivia, a reader both attentive and well attuned to Pasternak's poetry, very aptly described his predilections for movement and action as the dynamism of a man sitting at his desk. In Safe Conduct, speaking of the aims of art, Pasternak contrasts it with science, which using the empirical means at its disposal perceives natural phenomena visually. In a section of a column of light, in other words, is able to record only a state. But since life is a dynamic process rather than a state, a simple scientific statement of fact cannot keep up with life's movement. While science is uttering its truth, life marches on, and scientific truth falls behind and becomes depictive. Energy is the only aspect of consciousness that needs some tangible proof of its existence, because it is evident only at the moment of its appearance. Art is the only means capable of depicting energy, lasting only for the instant of its manifestation energy can be expressed only by shifting language of images, that is the language, the accompanying signs. In terms of individual consciousness, energy is emotion. Human spirit cannot be confined to the material world. It transcends it. As Pasternak wrote in an early writings, that is in 1917, man's spirit has no place to live, if not the world catered anew. The material world, inert and static, calls for an active, creative interference, and this is art's sphere of action. Art attempts to achieve a transformation from a static to a dynamic state, to succeed in setting off the inert and the static at the speed matching life's, to induce the past to catch up with life's movements. The aim of the art of Pasternak is in switching that which is being depicted from the cold axles to the hot. Pasternak's dynamism is a dynamism of W.H. Auden wrote that technique in itself cannot make a good poem, but the lack of it can spoil one. Pasternak retained his faith in the transforming powers of art until the very end. In the year 1958, he wrote of art as more powerful in changing life than the storms changing the face of nature. The hand of an artist is even more omnipotent in washing off dirt and dust from everything. Life and reality appears more transformed, coming out of the artist's dyed works. His poet in a tale, that is in the year 1929, described the immense power at the disposal of a creative artist, in more paradoxical terms, as capable of destroying both material objects and social institutions and conventions. Tanova speaks of Pushkin, of themes and variations, as Pushkin not in his standard and long accepted guise, and who is, as a result, the novel appearance of the descendant of a flat-lipped hermit. Tearing off the mask in Pasternak's poetry is justified in Tanova's opinion, that is, by the usual, specific and casual point of view of childhood, illness, etc. The situations of which Pasternak chooses to speak by their very nature call attention to the usual non-apparent aspects of things. That is, the distorted view is justified by the condition itself. Trying to select one of the most characteristic elements of Tolstoy's art, Pasternak comes to the conclusion that it was his usual originality which in Pasternak's interpretation becomes very similar to the effects produced by his own poetic vision. All his life, at any given time, he possessed an ability to see phenomena in the isolated finality of a separated moment in exhaustive and sharp relief, as we see things only on rare occasions. In childhood, on a crust of all renewing happinesses, or in the triumph of a great spiritual victory. For Pasternak, an artist's destiny is similar to acting a difficult and responsible part. Speaking of the poet's destiny, Pasternak repeatedly returns to the image of acting on stage. The beginning of the poet's career is referred to as a duet, the place where he acquired his experience as an arena. In Safe Conduct, describing his giving up of the romantic view of the poet's life that inevitably leads to a tragic end, Pasternak suggests that he awarded his fate by abandoning this world's view at a time when it was non-compulsory and mild, did not presume heroism, and did not smell of blood. As early as 1931, the year of publication of Safe Conduct, Pasternak wrote his famous and often quoted poems about the unheard of simplicity. To conclude, it has been repeatedly and convincingly suggested that Pasternak had an affinity with Romanticism. Specific links between his poetry and certain features of the poetry of the Russian Romantics. It is highly characteristic of Pasternak that after his early and short-lived participation in the futurist centrifuge, he very consistently avoided associating himself not only with the contemporary literary organizations and trends, but also with literary movements and in a broader sense. Art in Pasternak's view was not engaged in imitating nature, but rather in continuing its creative work. Among Russian symbolists, Bloch and Scriabin were most influential for Pasternak's formative period. The elements of Scriabin's world's view, his influence was the earliest and perhaps the strongest, that he had the greatest impact on the young Pasternak, where the beliefs were transforming into powerful art, and in the exceptional role assigned to be creative artist. It has to be remembered that one of the fundamental characteristics of Pasternak's personality was the extreme selectivity of approach. The romantic view of the significance of an individual took a Christian turn in his whole world. Pasternak went further than just asserting the value of every individual. His poet cannot exist without other people. Pasternak's aversion to organization and societies reflected his strong anti-utopian convictions. His mistrust of collective actions, which, as he was to remark without exception, are tinged with hysteria, only strengthened his faith in the individual. As one of the poet's goals, Pasternak saw his creative influence on his time, that is, not openly, not collectively, but internally and invisibly. I hope you have enjoyed Boris Pasternak's poem Spring, his dynamism, his passion for art and poetry. Thank you and see you in the next session.